In most history books, Sumer is often presented as a clear point of origin for human civilization, the place where writing first emerged, where the earliest cities took shape, and where power was first given a name, the king. Yet behind this familiar image lies a far more unusual record, the list of 61 Sumerian kings. This list does not tell a single, continuous story. It stretches across dynasties shaped by myth, rulers said to have lived for thousands of years, periods where authority appears almost nameless, and finally, toward a moment when history begins to leave traces that can be physically touched. It is not only a question of who ruled, but a deeper one, how the Sumerians understood power, order, and memory across time. In this video, we are not trying to prove whether these kings truly lived for impossibly long lifespans. Instead, we listen to the king list the way the Sumerians themselves may have remembered it, as a flow of ideas where power slowly shifts from the divine to the human, from symbol to system, from shared memory to history carved into stone. We invite you to join Bedtime History in stepping into the world of the 61 Sumerian kings, not to search for final answers, but to observe how history itself began learning how to remember in the quiet passage of time. Before history was told through familiar timelines, the Sumerians imagined power in a very different way. It did not appear as the result of conflict or conquest, but as a natural principle, quiet, steady, and needing no explanation. Power in this memory was not something humans seized. It was bestowed as part of the order of the world itself. The first name to carry this order was Alulim. He is remembered as the first king of Sumer, ruling in Eridu, a place regarded as the oldest city where organized life first began to take shape. Alulim stands at the beginning of the king list not because he was greater than those who followed, but because he represents the moment when everything was first placed into its original position. In the ancient records, Alulim does not appear as a fully formed human figure. There are no descriptions of personality, no stories of family or conflict. He is not told as a character, but as a fixed point. Here, power has not yet taken on a human form. It exists as an axis, where heaven and earth are joined, where order first finds its rhythm. The length of Alulim's reign, as the Sumerians recorded it, stretches so far that it sounds impossible to modern ears. But this number was not meant to claim that humans once lived that long. It reflects a different sense of time. In the primordial age, time had not yet been divided into smaller units, and power did not need to change quickly. Order lasted long enough that it was never questioned. Under Alulim, Eridu is not described as an expanding kingdom or a military center. It appears instead as an anchor. Rituals are performed regularly. The relationship between humans and the gods is carefully maintained. The king does not stand above the divine nor apart from the community. He remains in between, as the one who keeps the rhythm of the world in motion. In Sumerian memory, Alulim does not end his reign through upheaval. He does not fall, and he is not replaced by violence. Power here does not come to an end. It withdraws, and in withdrawing, it is passed on. This transfer happens quietly, in the same manner that order itself has existed from the beginning. As the name Alulim slowly fades into silence, the story does not break, nor does it turn in a new direction. Order remains in Eridu, continuing its familiar rhythm. And Alalangar appears not as a dramatic succession, but as a continuing breath, gentle, steady, and undisturbing to the flow that was already set in place. The surviving records do not note any upheaval or major change during this period. There is no sign of an ending and no opening toward something new. Power simply passes quietly to the next holder, while order remains intact, continuing along a familiar course with no reason yet to transform itself. Within this setting, Alalngar is not remembered as the founder of a new age, but as someone who remained fully within the old one. If Alulim represents the moment when power first appears, then Alalngar embodies its continuation, silent, enduring, and no longer in need of reaffirmation. In the Sumerian king list, the name Alalngar is recorded without grand narratives attached to it. There are no accounts of victories, no reforms, no signs of conflict. And it is precisely this absence that reveals what the Sumerians chose to remember, not what happened, but the fact that order was never interrupted. The Sumerians do not tell of Alalngar conquering new lands, nor do they say he established new laws. What they preserve instead is the length of his presence, long enough for order to cease being something new. Under Alalngar, power is no longer a principle freshly descended from the heavens, but something familiar woven into everyday life. The length of Alalngar's reign, like that of Alulim, is recorded in numbers that lie far beyond any biological measure. This is not meant to speak of human lifespan. It reflects a different sense of time, one in which change unfolds very slowly, and the world does not yet require constant adjustment to endure. Eridu in this period does not appear as a center of power in the sense of rule or domination. It is a center of memory. Rituals are repeated. Patterns are preserved. The king does not create order, but safeguards it. Alalngar stands before history, not as a figure of action, but as a guardian, keeping the bond between gods and humans from fully closing. In the Sumerian tradition, Alalngar is remembered not for what he changed, but for what he did not do. He did not break the old order, nor did he push the world in a new direction. And in this restraint lies a very different understanding of power, that at times ruling is found not in action, but in holding back. The reign of Alalngar gradually fades, and Sumerian memory preserves its familiar continuity. No fractures appear, no interruptions emerge, only a quiet transition in which power continues to be passed on in a state of stability, though no longer remaining in Eridu. Order gently departs from its original point of origin and comes to rest in Bad Tibira, without upheaval or visible rupture, yet enough to suggest a subtle movement. From this moment on, order is no longer anchored to a single center, but begins to travel alongside a human community that is slowly expanding. At Bad Tibira, the story no longer remains still at its original place of birth. Power in this new city gradually takes on a different character, no longer existing primarily as a ritual principle or an abstract cosmic order, but slowly merging into a way of life that is coming into being, tied to labor, to professions, and to the growing web of mutual dependence among people in a society that is beginning to take shape. Bad Tibira is not remembered as a city of the gods, but as a space of work. Herding, metalworking, and activities that demand steady rhythms define this place. The movement of power to Bad Tibira reveals a subtle shift. Order no longer exists only to maintain balance between heaven and earth, but to coordinate a society that is becoming increasingly complex. The figure who stands at the center of this transition is En-men-lu-ana. In the Sumerian king list, his reign is still recorded as lasting for a span that exceeds modern imagination. Yet unlike the kings of Eridu, this number no longer carries the sense of absolute eternity. It suggests a different rhythm of time, one measured by seasons, by herds, and by cycles of labor, where everything unfolds slowly, steadily, and through repetition. The Sumerians do not describe Enmenluana as a warrior or a conqueror. They do not place him within great conflicts. What they preserve instead is his role in sustaining the functioning of society at a moment when people were no longer living in small, isolated groups, but beginning to bind themselves together through shared work and common obligations. Under Enmenluana, power does not need to display itself. It is present in everyday life, in each person knowing what they do, where they belong, and upon whom they depend. Order is no longer felt as something imposed from outside, but as a familiar part of the daily rhythm. Power here does not stand above people. It exists among them. If Alulim and Alalngar stood closer to the divine than to humanity, then Enmenluana stands closer to humanity than to the divine. He is no longer a bridge between two worlds, but a point of support for a society that is steadily growing. Order is no longer upheld primarily through ritual, but through habit, discipline, and the repetition of working life. In Sumerian memory, Bad Tibira thus becomes a symbol of a quiet transition from a cosmic order to a social one. Once power has descended to the earth, it cannot remain forever in its original purity. It must adapt to lived reality, to labor, and to the very concrete limits of human life. The period of Enmenluana comes to a close without revealing any visible shift in the familiar structure. Order remains anchored in Bad Tibira, continuing to exist in the same space with only the keeper of that order changing. This continuity does not create a clear turning point, but it opens the conditions for slower, deeper transformations to begin accumulating within social life itself. It is within this context that Enmen-Gal-Ana appears as Bad Tibira gradually moves away from the simplicity of its earliest phase. Society at this point has taken on more layers, with overlapping relationships and an increasingly tangible weight. Power no longer serves only to keep the collective functioning stable. It quietly carries the burden of an expanding community, where complexity does not arise from sudden events, but from the steady growth of human life itself. If the previous reign bound power to labor and steady rhythms, then under Enmen-Gal-Ana, society seems large enough to begin exerting pressure on its own order. Activities that once unfolded almost naturally now require more frequent adjustment. Relationships that were once simple begin to overlap, and balance can no longer sustain itself as effortlessly as before. The Sumerian king list still records the length of Enmen-Gal-Ana's reign in numbers that exceed all biological limits, yet the sense of permanence has changed. It is no longer light as it was in the time of Eridu, nor as even as in the early years at Bad Tibira. It carries the feeling of a period extended not by harmony, but by the absence of a force strong enough to bring change, a time in which order persists but no longer feels at ease. The Sumerians left no detailed accounts of Enmen-Gal-Ana's decisions or actions, and this silence speaks volumes. Perhaps he is not remembered for what he did, but for what he bore. A structure growing steadily heavier. Power at this stage is no longer just about keeping society in rhythm, but about taking responsibility for the quiet tensions forming within it. Bad Tibira under Enmen-Gal-Ana does not collapse, but it does not expand either. It resembles a society standing still while in motion. Everything continues, yet nothing feels light. The king is no longer a pure symbol of order, but someone positioned within a web of entangled relationships, striving to keep a fragile balance from tipping too far in any direction. In the stream of Sumerian memory, Enmen-Gal-Ana marks the moment when ruling begins to carry a different kind of weight. Power no longer appears as a natural state of order, but as an ongoing task, one that demands endurance more than innovation. When order endures long enough, it begins to generate its own quiet pressures, tensions that the familiar structure can no longer resolve on its own. This shift does not appear as a visible event. It forms in silence, accumulates over time, and only in the next generation does it begin to take clearer shape. Dumuzid, the shepherd, enters the story at that point. Here, the center is no longer firmly tied to a city or an abstract system, but gathers around the image of a specific human being, closer to everyday life and therefore more vulnerable. After a long period anchored in Bad Tibira, the stream of memory subtly changes its tone. Order is no longer imagined primarily through invisible principles or through social layers growing ever thicker, but through a figure that can be touched and felt. Dumuzid appears as a sign that the Sumerian view of kingship has shifted, no longer the embodiment of an abstract structure, but the presence of a human being standing within the community, carrying both closeness and the unavoidable limits of his own condition. In the Sumerian king list, Dumuzid is still recorded as having ruled for a span that exceeds all modern measures. Yet what sets him apart is not that number, it is his title. For the first time, a king is remembered not through a city or a ritual role, but through an occupation, the shepherd. This single detail opens a different understanding of power. A shepherd does not rule from a fixed center. He moves with his flock, living amid land, weather, and the uncertainty of nature. When Dumuzid enters Sumerian memory as a king, power no longer stands apart from everyday life. It travels with people, touching the very real limits of human existence. In Sumerian tradition, Dumuzid is not only a political figure, he is bound to cycles of growth, to seasons, to the repeating rhythm of life and death. This suggests that the king is no longer seen as standing above the natural order, but as part of it, subject to forces beyond human control. Unlike the kings before him, Dumuzid carries tragedy. He becomes the first image of power that can be interrupted, weakened, even pulled down from a position once considered sacred. In this image, order is no longer immutable. It becomes vulnerable, much like the humans living within it. In this period, Bad Tibira no longer appears as an absolutely stable center. It becomes the place where the Sumerians begin to sense that power, regardless of its origin, must also face loss. The king is no longer an unmoving pillar, but a living being who can depart from the world, leaving a void behind for the community. With Dumuzid, the Sumerian way of looking back at the past gains emotional depth. Order no longer appears as a purely cosmic arrangement, but as a story about people living within that world, working, belonging, and eventually being forced to face separation. From this moment on, history is remembered not only through structures of governance, but through the feeling of loss that accompanies a stability once taken for granted. After Dumuzid, the primordial state can no longer be recovered. A subtle misalignment has entered the way the past is imagined. Memory no longer flows as seamlessly as before, but opens into necessary silences, as if the world itself must slow down to regain balance, before drifting toward new forms of rule, more layered, more complex, and increasingly distant from the simplicity of the beginning. From that quiet pause, authority does not disappear, but slowly withdraws from Bad Tibira. What remains suggests that it comes to rest in Larak, a city rarely mentioned, neither crowned with brilliance nor marked by remembered tragedy. It is precisely this absence of noise that makes Larak noticeable, like a silent stop within the deeper, unseen reordering of the Sumerian world. Larak is not a ritual center like Eridu, nor is it shaped by labor and production cycles like Bad Tibira. It lies at the edge of what was once considered essential. Allowing power to settle here suggests that the Sumerians were not seeking a new beginning, but a point of support, distant enough to avoid repeating loss, yet close enough to prevent order from dissolving. Ensi-Pad-Zid-Ana appears in the Sumerian king list without great stories attached to his name. There is no prominent myth, no remembered catastrophe. His name stands there like a steady breath, marking a span of time in which power does not need to assert itself. The length of Ensi-Pad-Zid-Ana's reign, like that of the kings before him, is still recorded on a mythic scale. Yet the feeling it carries is different. It no longer suggests eternity, nor does it feel heavy or strained. It resembles a duration just long enough, a moment in which the world does not lean further in any direction. Under Ensi-Pad-Zid-Ana, power becomes cautious. It does not seek new symbols, does not attempt to restore original purity, and does not expand its reach. After taking on human form and passing through loss, power learns restraint. In Sumerian memory, Larak becomes something like an inner refuge. Here, the king is neither hero nor saint. He exists as a keeper of rhythm, enough to prevent society from falling apart, but not forceful enough to push it into new motion. There is no dazzling prosperity, yet there is no collapse. The fact that nothing great happens becomes the quiet message of this period. The Sumerians seem to suggest that after loss, what is needed is not greatness, but continuation. Power, in this moment, is measured by its ability to keep life from breaking. Ensi-Pad-Zid-Ana is therefore not remembered as someone who changed history. He is preserved in memory as the one who kept history from breaking apart, a silent balance, a span of time in which the world was allowed to steady itself once more. This phase gradually comes to a close, and order begins to move again. This time, memory shifts from Larak and comes to rest in Sippar, a city associated with light, with measurement, and with knowledge. This is no longer a hesitant step after rupture, but a clearer choice in how the Sumerians imagined where continuity would next be grounded. At this point, the way the past is remembered begins to change. After long periods of preservation, endurance, and self-balancing, order no longer exists merely to be maintained, but becomes something to be observed and understood. It is here that Enmen-Dur-Ana appears as the king of a singular moment, one in which memory suggests that humanity drew closer to the divine not through ritual or myth, but through the path of knowledge. In the Sumerian king list, Enmen-Dur-Ana does not stand out for the length of his reign or for political authority. His name is preserved for a different reason: his direct relationship with the gods. He is the first king said to have been taken up into the heavens, not to rule, but to learn. This detail marks a profound shift in Sumerian memory. Where earlier the king served to prevent order from collapsing, here the king becomes a recipient of knowledge. Power no longer lies in coordinating society, but in understanding the principles by which the world itself operates. The Sumerians tell that Enmendur-Ana learned to read the signs of the sky, the movements of the sun, the moon, and the rhythm of time. Rules once belonging solely to the gods are now entrusted to humans, but not directly. They pass through a single intermediary, the king. Sippar, the city associated with light and the sun god, becomes the fitting setting for this story. Here, power is not measured by walls or ritual acts, but by understanding. The king stands between two realms, between what humans can see and what must be interpreted. Enmendur-Ana is not remembered as a figure of action. He does not expand territory, nor does he reshape social order. His role lies in transmission. In Sumerian memory, he is the one who carries knowledge from the realm above to the realm below, allowing the world to continue moving in rhythm. For this reason, Enmendur-Ana is often regarded as the symbolic ancestor of priests, diviners, and keepers of knowledge. His legacy does not reside in visible deeds, but in a new idea. That order must be understood, and that understanding can be accumulated and passed on. Yet knowledge carries a quiet paradox. As humans are granted understanding, they draw closer to the divine, and at the same time become more aware of the distance that cannot be crossed. From this moment on, the world is no longer entirely innocent. After Enmendur-Ana, the tone of Sumerian memories slows. The light of Sippar closes a phase of opening. The final king before the great flood is no longer associated with knowledge or insight, but with preparation for an ending. From Sippar, the current of memory continues and comes to rest at Shuruppak. At this destination, the story no longer turns toward the sky or toward higher knowledge, but quietly faces forward, toward an event taking shape, and toward a moment when the order of the world is about to be tested in an entirely different way. Shuruppak lies low, close to the river, close to water, and close to the fragility of human life. In this place, Ubar-Tutu appears not as a receiver of further knowledge, but as the king of a moment of quiet gathering, where order is preserved with the awareness that an ending is slowly drawing near. In the Sumerian king list, Ubar-Tutu is the final king before the Great Flood. He is not remembered as someone who opens a new era, but as a witness to the last days of an order that has endured for too long. It is this role that gives his reign a different tone, subdued, heavy, and filled with a sense of foreboding. Shuruppak is not a city of radiant power. It is a city of everyday life, of families, of crafts, of rivers that both sustain and threaten human existence. The decision for power to come to rest here suggests that Sumerian memory placed the end of an age not at the highest point, but at the place closest to ordinary human life. Ubar-Tutu is not associated with victories or reforms. In the ancient telling, he exists as a fatherly figure, a preserver of life as the world moves steadily toward its own boundary. The length of his reign is still measured on a mythic scale, yet the feeling it leaves behind is not one of eternity, but of waiting. Unlike Enmendur-Ana, who was granted knowledge to understand the order of the cosmos, Ubar-Tutu represents a different realization that understanding does not equal control. Even when order has been arranged, even when knowledge has been passed on, the world can still slip into chaos, not because humans have failed, but because some cycles lie beyond their reach. In later traditions, Ubar-Tutu is remembered indirectly through his son, the one who will survive the Great Flood. Yet in the earliest Sumerian memory, he is not the hero of salvation. He is the stopping point of an age where history does not end with war or social collapse, but with water. When the reign of Tutu comes to a close, there is no transfer of power in the familiar sense. Instead, there is a deep absence, a space in which every former order is erased. The Great Flood does not only wash away cities, but sweeps aside an entire way of understanding time and authority. As the waters slowly recede, the world no longer retains its former shape. Order returns, but it carries a new way of functioning, remembered in a different language. From this point on, memory turns away from the age before the Great Flood and enters a new phase, one in which myth grows quieter, and human experience begins to stand at the center of history. After the catastrophe, continuity no longer flows as seamlessly as before. A pause takes shape, not because history has stopped, but because what has passed can no longer be expressed through the old forms. As the ground slowly dries and order searches for a new point of support, rule emerges once more in Kish, and the first name remembered from the post-Great Flood age is Jushur. Jushur does not stand within a timeless world. He appears at the beginning of a new memory, one in which people begin to measure time more narrowly, more cautiously. Although the length of his reign is still recorded as long by ancient standards, the feeling it carries is different. Closer to a human lifespan, more fragile, and no longer assured. Kish, under Jushur, is not a center of ritual or sacred knowledge. It is a place where social life is reassembled. Here, power is no longer understood as something descending from the heavens, but as something that must be rebuilt from what remains. The king does not keep the rhythm of the cosmos. He helps people live together, divide responsibility, and avoid slipping back into chaos. In the Sumerian telling, Jushur is not surrounded by grand myths. This silence carries clear meaning. After the catastrophe, power is no longer seen as an expression of cosmic order, but as a basic requirement for survival. Rule is no longer ritual. It is organization. Jushur represents the moment when history begins to slow. There are no longer spans of time that feel superhuman, no journeys to the heavens, no tragedies of cosmic scale. In their place comes the repetition of everyday life, rebuilding, cultivating the land, and remembering what has been lost. Kish, during this period, gradually becomes a symbol of something deeply human, the capacity to endure after destruction. And Jushur, though he leaves behind no radiant legacy, still holds a distinct place in Sumerian memory, not because he changed the world, but because he helped the world continue. As Jushur's role quietly comes to an end, Kish remains as a familiar center, though its organization no longer follows its original form. Order is now maintained through new, more layered structures, closely tied to everyday life and bearing the clear imprint of human history taking shape after the Great Flood. From here, the current of memory moves on to Kulasinabel, as the new world learns to arrange itself once more, searching for a stability sufficient to keep moving forward. At this point, Kish is no longer seen as the birthplace of all things, but as a point of support that keeps the world standing. Governance is still present, yet the rhythm of memory has slowed and grown quieter, steady, less focused on individual figures, and reflective of a moment when shared order takes precedence over the person entrusted with maintaining it. In the Sumerian king list, Kulasinabel appears as a faint name. There is no clear image, no emphasized story. And this faintness is not an accidental omission, but a sign of an important shift in how the Sumerians remembered power. After the Great Flood, as life demands continuous organization, rule no longer rests on a singular, outstanding individual. Power begins to function as a mechanism. It exists in division of labor, in the repetition of tasks, and in rules that are followed without needing to be restated each day. Kulasinabel represents this moment. He is not remembered as someone who introduces change, but as someone who allows order to keep functioning. If Jushur helped the world rise again after collapse, then Kulasinabel helps it remain upright, not through symbols, but through stability. The length of his reign, though still recorded as long by ancient measures, no longer carries the feeling of eternity or myth. It resembles an even stretch of time in which things proceed smoothly enough that they do not require retelling. When order works well, memory produces no new story. Kish under Kulasinabel is not a city of events, it is a city of habit. Power does not need to be constantly present in collective memory because it has already settled into law, into social roles, and into the daily rhythm of human life. In the historical memory of Sumer, Kulasinabel marks a significant transformation. Power is no longer remembered as a symbol attached to a person, but as a self-operating system. When power takes this form, a new distance appears, no longer between gods and king, but between people and the structure that governs their lives. Continuity unfolds quietly. Kish remains the place where power is anchored, but individual traces grow faint. Within this setting, the name Nanjiklishma appears as a small marker, suggesting that order begins to allow a human figure to be remembered once again, not as the one who shapes the system, but as someone who exists within it. The mention of Nanjiklishma does not aim to declare a clear turning point. It simply reveals a shift in Sumerian memory, from recalling nameless structures to cautiously naming an individual within the limits the system allows and without stepping beyond the order already in place. There are no great myths attached to Nanjiklishma. He is not told as the one who restores the world, nor as the founder of a new order. And it is precisely this absence that reflects the period in which he exists, a time when society is stable enough to no longer require heroes, yet still needs a face to represent the order that continues to function. Kish, under the reign of Nanjiklishma, is no longer a city of beginnings or reconstruction. It is a society moving at a steady pace where the king does not create law, but stands within an existing framework. Power at this stage does not need to prove itself as sacred. It needs to be recognizable as a familiar point of balance. The length of Nanjiklishma's reign, recorded in the customary manner of the Sumerian king list, still carries traces of myth. Yet the feeling it leaves behind is different. It is no longer eternal nor fully abstract. It resembles a human life extended within memory, long enough to be named, but not distinct enough to become legend. In recording this name, the Sumerians seem to be doing something deeply human, giving a name to stability. In a world without major upheaval, remembering an individual is not meant to glorify, but to confirm that order still has someone at its head, even though that role has been greatly reduced compared to the past. Nanjiklishma leaves no mark of reform or conflict. And this too speaks a quiet truth. Most of history is not shaped by dramatic turning points, but by long stretches in which nothing remarkable occurs. It is precisely these stretches that allow societies to endure, to accumulate experience, and to keep moving forward. As Nanjiklishma's role comes to a close, power remains anchored in Kish, yet it no longer exists as a fixed presence. It begins to lean toward action, careful, incremental, as if the familiar order is quietly preparing to face new challenges ahead. After a long period of stability, change appears very gently, without taking the form of upheaval or rupture. With Entara Ana, power no longer serves only as a representative of order, but begins to act back upon the very structure that supports it. Kish, under the reign of Entara Ana, is not a society in crisis. Everything continues to function in a steady rhythm, and precisely because of this calm, any intervention by the king becomes easier to sense. When the world is no longer chaotic, traces of action are no longer hidden. They appear, even if only faintly. The Sumerian king list does not record what Entara Ana specifically did. Yet this silence no longer carries the meaning of anonymity seen in the time of Kulasina Bel. It creates a different impression that power is entering a grey zone, a space where action has begun but not yet with enough force to become a story. Entara Ana represents the moment when the king begins to be perceived as a factor within history itself. He does not restore order like Jushur, nor does he merely embody it like Nanjiklishma. He stands in between, where power begins to express intention, still cautious, still not fully confident. The length of Entara Ana's reign, though recorded according to familiar conventions, no longer suggests endless duration. It feels like a span long enough to leave an effect, yet short enough for personal memory not to dissolve. This is a significant sign. Sumerian history is moving closer to a human sense of time. Kish now appears as a society that can be adjusted not only by natural disaster or catastrophe, but by human decisions. Power no longer simply reflects an existing order. It begins to participate in shaping that order, even while remaining within perceived limits of safety. When the reign of Entara Ana comes to a close, no notable event marks the transition. Yet a quiet change has taken place. Power has grown accustomed to intervening, and once that habit is formed, returning to a purely passive state becomes difficult. Power remains anchored in Kish, but the manner of its presence grows increasingly visible. With Babum, the boundary between preservation and control begins to blur, not through sudden turning points, but through the repetition of decisions that become gradually more direct. After Entara Ana, power takes another small step forward, one that carries weight. It no longer merely touches order, but begins to shape it in ways that can be felt. Babum is closely associated with this quiet shift. Babum does not appear as a grand mythic figure, nor is he described as someone who reshapes the world. Yet within the dry sequence of the kings of Kish, his name marks a different phase, a moment when power is no longer entirely neutral. Under Babum, the king does not simply represent order or intervene with restraint. He begins to grow accustomed to control. For the Sumerians, control does not mean violence or tyranny in a modern sense. At its core, it means setting boundaries, determining what rhythm is correct and what rhythm has gone astray. In a society that has been stable for a long time, the act of setting limits carries its own weight. It reveals a distance between the ruler and those who are ruled. The length of Babum's reign, though still recorded as long by familiar standards, no longer carries a mythic tone. It feels like a sequence of years that can be remembered, a time in which the king's decisions leave tangible consequences, even if they are not yet great enough to become legend. The Sumerians do not need to tell the details. Recording the name alone is enough to acknowledge that a new style of rule has appeared. Kish under Babum does not descend into chaos, yet it no longer operates entirely on its own momentum. Order now requires more active maintenance. The king becomes directly responsible for this task. Power no longer hides within the system. It is present, even if still held within limits. Babum represents the moment when Sumerian history grows familiar with the idea that social order can be shaped. Not everything comes from the gods or from natural cycles. Part of order now emerges from human decision, and with that comes both risk and possibility. When Babum's presence comes to an end, power in Kish does not diminish. On the contrary, it has grown accustomed to being held in human hands, becoming a stable element of collective life. From this foundation, continuity moves on to Puanum, a stage where power is exercised more regularly and intervention in society becomes increasingly taken for granted. At this point, power no longer needs to search for its place. Its rhythm of operation has been established and sustained. With Puanum, ruling is no longer an experiment or a reaction to disruption, but becomes an everyday movement, repetitive, stable, and tightly bound to the life of the community. Puanum is not remembered as the one who opens a new era, and this in itself speaks volumes. Under his reign, order no longer needs to be founded or justified. It has existed long enough to be accepted as a natural part of life, even though the nature of power has now drifted far from its primordial origins. The Sumerian king list records the length of Puanum's reign in extended numbers, yet the feeling they evoke is no longer one of eternity. It resembles a sequence of recurring days in which power is exercised steadily, without display and without the need for explanation. This is the mark of a society that has normalized governance. Kish, under Puanum, neither collapses nor erupts. It functions. And within that smooth functioning lies a profound transformation. Power is no longer something temporarily entrusted, but a stable position within the social structure. The king does not need to leave a personal mark because his function is already clearly defined. Puanum represents the moment when the Sumerians seem to recognize that power, when extended over time, gradually loses its original sacred quality. It is no longer an expression of cosmic order nor a response to crisis. It becomes a social reality, both necessary and vulnerable to misuse. In collective memory, the reign of Puanum leaves behind no great story, and that is entirely fitting. Periods like this are rarely remembered, yet they form the groundwork for later transformations. When power becomes habit, it opens the path toward more clearly defined forms of rule in multiple directions. Upon this established foundation, Kish continues forward. Power does not weaken but gradually acquires more distinct features, embedding itself deeper into the structure of shared life. With Caliban, power no longer merely operates society but begins to leave direct marks upon the people who live within it. After Puanum, the presence of power in Kish is no longer something to be questioned. It becomes a familiar reality, woven steadily into everyday life. Under Caliban, rule no longer merely coordinates order, but gradually shapes behavior, habits, and the way people understand their own place in the world. Caliban does not appear as a figure of disruption. He does not break the old order, nor does he construct a new one. Yet it is precisely this prolonged stability that reveals something essential. Power has permeated society. It no longer needs to speak loudly because roles, obligations, and limits have been internalized by the community itself. The length of Calibum's reign, as usual, is recorded as long by the measure of the king list, but the impression it leaves does not lie in the number of years, but in the depth of its influence. People are born, grow, work, and age within the same governing structure. Order no longer comes and goes, it becomes the environment of life itself. Kish under Calibum is a society where power no longer needs to be constantly present at the center. It has been distributed into law, into custom, and into the way people understand their own roles. The king is no longer a frequent intervener, but a guarantor of a system that now operates on its own. Calibum represents the moment when history begins to raise a quiet question. When order shapes people for too long, do people still retain the ability to reshape order? The Sumerians do not answer this question. They simply record the name as a marker, showing that society has reached a certain depth of stability. The reign of Calibum passes without tragedy, myth, or revelation. This calm suggests that power has been fully normalized. Yet in history, states of such balance rarely endure for long. After Calibum, power remains anchored in Kish, but small adjustments begin to appear in how it functions. With Calumum, society shows signs of an order that has grown familiar enough to begin experimenting with difference from within the existing framework. At this point, Kish is no longer in a phase of formation or early stabilization. Order has become something natural, requiring neither affirmation nor justification. Governance does not expand, nor does it tighten its grip, but quietly adjusts itself from within. Calumum is not remembered as a disruptive figure, yet he is not merely repeating what already exists. In a society where order has taken deep root, every change must unfold gently. Any movement that becomes too visible risks disturbing a balance that has been sustained for far too long. Calumum's reign therefore carries the character of fine adjustment rather than reform. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of his reign in extended numbers. But at this stage, that length no longer suggests eternity or power. It speaks, instead of continuity, of a system flexible enough to endure without needing to alter its outward form. Kish under Calumum is a society accustomed to roles, obligations, and limits. People no longer need to learn how to live within order. They are born into it. As a result, power does not need to impose itself. It needs only to ensure that small adjustments do not disturb the rhythm of the whole. Calumum marks a moment that is difficult to grasp. There is no conflict, no tragedy, and no myth. The absence of events reveals a society functioning with enough stability to leave no clear markers. History continues evenly without sharp turns and without interruption. States like this often accumulate tension in silence. When order becomes too familiar, people begin to brush against its limits, even if they cannot yet name them. Power therefore shifts almost imperceptibly, not through rupture or dramatic change, but through subtle adjustments that tilt the old balance just enough for the process to continue in a different direction. After many generations of stability and subtle adjustment, Kish enters a new rhythm, sensed more through feeling than through events. Under Zukakip, power remains present, and order continues to function, yet the familiar cadence no longer moves as smoothly as before. Zukakip is not told as the cause of crisis, yet he is also not remembered as someone who preserved perfect balance. His reign represents the moment when small adjustments are no longer enough to conceal a growing misalignment, not a collapse, but many minor deviations accumulating over time. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Zukarkeep's reign according to established convention. But within the flow of memory, that length begins to carry a different meaning. It no longer speaks of stability, but of the extension of a condition that has begun to tire. Order persists, but it has lost some of its former flexibility. Kish under Zukarkeep is a society that still functions, yet must exert greater effort to maintain balance. Roles that were once clearly defined begin to overlap. Limits that were once accepted start to be tested, even though no one is yet strong enough or ready enough to break them. Zukarkeep represents the moment when power shifts into a reactive state. Rather than shaping order, the king responds to the consequences of a system that has been operating for too long. This produces no myth, but it creates quiet pressure, the kind that history often recognizes only after it has passed. No specific stories are attached to Zukarkeep. This absence reflects a simple reality. When power can no longer generate a new order, it also fails to produce memorable landmarks. Its role is reduced to one task alone, preventing society from collapsing. Once misalignment has taken shape, it rarely disappears on its own. If it is not recognized in time, it spreads. After Zukarkeep, instability in Kish is no longer vague. It becomes clear enough to demand a direct response. From this point on, power can no longer postpone choosing how it will act. Under Atab, power no longer remains at a distance. After a long period of quiet shifting, rule is compelled to tighten, not in order to expand its reach, but to prevent the risk of fragmentation that is becoming increasingly visible within society. Atab is not remembered as the creator of a new order, nor as a figure of expansion. Yet he is also no longer a ruler of gentle adjustment like those before him. Under Atab, power takes on the form of direct intervention. What was once left to habit and system now requires closer oversight and firmer control. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Atab's reign in extended numbers. But within the current of memory, this length no longer conveys endurance. It feels instead like a prolonged tension, a period in which order is preserved through constant effort, rather than through the natural consensus that once sustained it. Kish under Atab becomes a society where power is more clearly visible, not always through force, but through frequent intervention. The king no longer merely guarantees the system, he must actively manage it, repairing areas that have begun to crack. Atab represents the moment when power loses its invisibility. When order functions smoothly, rule can hide within habit and law. When order wavers, power is forced into view. And that visibility always comes at a cost. The distance between ruler and society becomes more sharply defined. There are no records of rebellion or collapse under Atab. Yet this period is not remembered as an age of prosperity either. It exists as a phase of strained preservation, one in which order still stands but has lost its flexibility. After Atab, power in Kish retains its position, but it now carries a different shape. Having grown accustomed to restraint and pressure, it can no longer return easily to its earlier lightness. Continuity moves on to Mashta, reflecting a society living within an order maintained by increasingly visible force. From this point on, control is no longer a temporary response but a permanent condition. Under Mashta, order does not exist because it is naturally accepted, but because it does not allow disintegration to take place. Mashta is not remembered as a reformer, nor is he portrayed as a tyrant. He appears as the inheritor of a system already under strain, one in which power must intervene continuously to keep everything standing. In such circumstances, ruling is no longer an art, but a prolonged act of endurance. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Mashta's reign in familiar numbers. Yet within the flow of memory, that length does not suggest stability. It feels like the extension of a fatigued state. No major turning point, no clear recovery, only sustained pressure applied to prevent collapse. Kish under Mashta is a society that still exists but struggles to breathe. Limits are imposed more frequently, flexibility diminishes, and the distance between power and everyday life becomes unmistakable. Power is no longer invisible. It is present as a weight, felt day after day. Mashta represents the moment when power begins to reveal its own exhaustion. When rule relies on pressure for too long, it drains both the ruler and society. The Sumerians do not need detailed stories to convey this. Placing the name Mashta within a sequence of strained reigns is enough. The reign of Mashta does not end in collapse, yet it leaves behind a clear consequence. When order is maintained through sustained pressure over time, that very pressure creates the conditions for change, even if the change does not appear immediately. From this accumulated tension, power moves on to Arwium. Society begins to search for other ways to continue within a structure that has grown heavy, not through confrontation or rupture, but through slow adaptation, one careful step at a time. After the long period of tightening under Mashta, there is no sudden explosion or immediate collapse. Instead, a gentle adjustment takes place. Under Arwium, power in Kish no longer relies solely on pressure to maintain order, but begins to explore other methods, cautious, restrained, and less overt. Arwium does not appear as someone who frees society from strain. Yet he does not continue the path of blind enforcement either. His reign carries the character of moderation, a moment when power recognizes that if it depends only on pressure, the very foundation that supports it will gradually be exhausted. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Arwium's reign in extended numbers. But here, that length no longer suggests solidity or permanence. It feels more like a pause for breath, enough to keep society from collapsing, but not enough to allow full recovery. Kish under Arwium is a society in the process of self-adjustment, even if it lacks the language to name that process. Old structures remain in place, but the way they function has shifted. Power no longer presses constantly upon daily life as a visible weight. It steps back in small increments, allowing order to operate on its own within carefully maintained limits. Arwium represents a quiet moment of maturity in Sumerian memory. The realization that power, if it wishes to endure, must learn to restrain itself. This is not a moral ideal nor a sudden enlightenment. It is a survival reflex of a system that has passed through too much strain. Yet this moderation is not a final answer. It merely slows deeper tensions that continue to accumulate beneath the surface of Kish society. Even as the outer layers appear calmer, unresolved questions about order, power, and their limits remain unanswered. When the foundations of daily life no longer provide a sense of certainty, Kish society begins to seek meaning in a different direction. This shift does not occur through control or moderation, but through a desire to transcend earthly limits. In this context, Etana appears, known as the one who ascends to the sky, marking the moment when power turns away from the ground to search for answers in a higher realm. After the attempts at self-adjustment under Arwium, continuity no longer lies in small changes within the familiar order. Etana represents a different approach, not through a new method of ruling, but by questioning the very limits of humanity within a society that has grown accustomed to maintaining order. Etana is not remembered for administrative reform or for bringing lasting stability. In Sumerian tradition, he is remembered through a single image, the one who ascends to the sky. Not to escape the earth and not to become divine, but to search for what earthly order can no longer explain. The appearance of Etana is not accidental. After a long sequence of reigns centered on control, tightening, and then moderation, the Sumerians seem to sense that the deeper problems of power cannot be resolved through governance alone. Etana marks the moment when history returns to a very old question, this time asked by a society that has already passed through exhaustion and limitation. In collective memory, Etana does not rise to the heavens to receive new authority. He ascends in order to understand. This image reflects a subtle yet profound shift. People no longer accept order merely as something to be preserved, but begin to seek its meaning. Power, at this stage, confronts not only society, but the finitude of human existence itself. Kish under Etana is not a society in chaos, yet it is a society that has gone far enough in the experience of rule to realize that stability, however necessary, does not provide final answers. In this setting, the image of the king rising into the sky becomes a symbol of an attempt to step beyond the familiar cycle of order and control. Etana represents the moment when Sumerian memory touches myth once more, not to return to the age of beginnings, but to open a new depth of reflection. After all that has been endured, humanity once again lifts its gaze toward the sky, where it once believed order originated, but where now only questions remain. Unlike the time before the Great Flood, Etana carries no original innocence. He appears within a society already weary of order, and for this reason his upward journey does not lead to lasting restoration. It opens only a pause, sufficient for contemplation, but insufficient to transform the world. After Etana, power returns to the earth, but it no longer retains its earlier wholeness. The experience of crossing beyond limits leaves its trace, forcing rule to confront once again the very real constraints of earthly life. Continuity resumes within a world in which upward longing has begun to settle. From this point on, the focus no longer lies in transcendence, but in sustaining concrete life, repetitive, immediate, and impossible to postpone. Bali appears not as a pursuer of visions, but as the one who receives the consequences of the effort that has just concluded, a form of power returning to reality, carrying limits it no longer seeks to evade. Bali carries no grand myth, and it is precisely this absence that defines his role. After a period in which power sought meaning beyond everyday life, society requires a king grounded enough to restore familiar rhythms. Bali represents a return, not a return to origins, but a return to a reality altered by the recognition that power itself has limits. Kish under Bali does not collapse under the unresolved longings left by Etana. Yet it is no longer whole in the same way. The questions raised during Etana's time cannot be erased. They remain quietly present, like a new layer of awareness the society must learn to live with. Bali governs a community that knows order has limits, and that power cannot resolve everything through organization or discipline alone. The Sumerian king list records the length of Bali's reign in the familiar numbers, but the impression this reign leaves is not one of duration, but of caution. There are no sweeping reforms, no expansive ambitions, only the effort to keep society from drifting into confusion after having touched questions without easy answers. Bali represents a deeply human form of power. Power that accepts it is not all-encompassing. He does not attempt to revive the dream of ascent, nor does he deny it. His reign exists as a transitional pause, a space in which society learns to continue living and organizing while carrying unresolved understanding. Reigns like that of Bali rarely leave enduring marks, yet they are what prevent history from breaking apart. They exist as necessary passages bridging aspiration and reality, ideals and the limits human beings are able to endure. In Kish, order does not come to an end, but it no longer moves by old momentum. It enters a more subdued state where the central question is no longer how to transcend limits or merely survive, but how to remain upright within a society that has begun to look back at itself. Continuity from this point forward no longer unfolds as a natural reflex, but as a conscious search for balance after familiar patterns have shifted. Within this quiet shift, order in Kish gradually moves away from the unconscious foundation that once sustained it. A society that had looked upward toward dimensions beyond the human now turns back to the ground, carrying questions that remain unanswered. Enmenuna appears not as a new beginning, but as an attempt to reframe order through a different path, not through myth or distant visions, but through steady presence in everyday life, where order can exist only if it is felt day by day. Enmenuna is not remembered as one who seeks transcendence. He carries no image of ascent or revelation. Instead, he emerges as a king of consolidation. When society has come to understand that power is not all-encompassing, what becomes necessary is no longer grand vision, but consistency. Order does not need further sanctification, but it must prove that it can still function. The Sumerian king list records the length of Enmenuna's reign in its familiar manner, yet the impression this period leaves is neither weary prolongation nor temporary caution. It feels more like a deliberate stability, a moment when society accepts that, although order is imperfect, it remains the most viable point of support. Kish under Enmenuna is a society matured through historical experience. People no longer believe absolutely that power descends from the gods, yet they also no longer imagine they can escape order through symbolic journeys. They live in a world where power must be maintained through a measured degree of trust, not so high as to become illusion, and not so low as to fall apart. Enmenuna represents a moment when power does not attempt to renew its image. The king does not appear as a hero, nor as a prophet. He stands instead as the guarantor that rules still hold, boundaries still carry meaning, and society can still rely on a stable framework, even if that framework is no longer absolutely sacred. This is a form of power that has reached maturity. It does not need display, nor does it seek legitimacy from the sky. It rests on its ability to endure within human life. Yet within that very maturity lies a quiet signal. Order has drawn close to the limits of repetition. When the reign of Enmenuna comes to an end, power remains in Kish, but it can no longer sustain itself through stability alone. What once sufficed to create authority has grown familiar. Order, once accepted almost instinctively, now begins to require clearer signs to be acknowledged, not because it has grown stronger, but because it must be seen and felt within a society long accustomed to stability. Change therefore unfolds at the level of appearance. When laws and roles have become habit, they no longer generate respect on their own. Society begins to demand more visible forms of presence, not to impose authority, but to sustain attention and to remind people of the shared order that continues to operate. Melem Kish is closely tied to this need. His name carries a distinct tone. In Sumerian tradition, Melem evokes radiance and a sense of awe that causes people to pause and take notice. This does not necessarily speak of military force or sweeping reform, but of image, of how power presents itself before society. Melem Kish is not described as someone who restructures order. Laws continue to function, roles remain intact, yet under his reign, power is no longer satisfied with merely existing. It needs to be felt again. In a society long accustomed to stability, power turns to symbols to remind people that order is still there. Kish under Melem Kish does not fall into chaos. On the contrary, it operates smoothly. But that very smoothness has lost its original persuasive force. Power therefore clothes itself in more recognizable signs, ritual, form, public presence, not to expand its reach, but to sustain a trust that is quietly wearing thin. Melem Kish represents a moment familiar throughout history. When the inner strength of order weakens, form begins to increase. The Sumerians do not condemn this. They do not name it decay or pretense. They simply record it as a natural response of power when confronted with the quiet fatigue of society. The reign of Melem Kish leaves no mark of profound transformation. Yet it leaves behind a clear sensation. Power has begun to require effort in order to be acknowledged. And when power must be seen in order to exist, it signals that it has passed beyond its most natural phase, the phase in which order was accepted without display. When Melem Kish departs from the center, Kish does not collapse, but order enters a different mode of existence. The forms that once conveyed stability gradually lose their weight. Maintaining society can no longer rely on outward presence alone. In this context, a familiar path of continuation is chosen, lineage and succession, as a way of anchoring authority in lived continuity when consensus no longer arises on its own. Along with this shift, order in Kish withdraws from the space of display. After a period of emphasized form, it turns toward a quieter mode of existence, focused on keeping rhythm rather than expanding influence. Under Barsel Nuna, the center of attention is no longer the radiant signs of stability, but a simple and weighty question. How can society continue to be sustained when trust no longer comes to people on its own? Barsel Nuna is not remembered for striking actions or new symbols. He appears as a king of continuation. After passing through many forms of rule, myth, control, moderation, and display, Sumerian society seems no longer concerned with the question of how to rule. What matters more now is whether order can be carried forward at all. The reign of Barsel Nuna reflects a moment when power relies increasingly on continuity itself, not necessarily lineage in a strict sense, but the sense that order requires an unbroken chain. Once society has grown accustomed to the presence of authority, disruption becomes a greater fear than whether rule is strong or weak. Kish under Barsel Nuna does not collapse, yet it does not flourish. It exists in a state of fragile stability, where power is maintained not because it is admired, but because it has become familiar. The king does not need to be severe or resplendent. He needs to be present at the right moment, in the right role, so that the chain of continuation is not broken. Barsal Nuna appears at a late stage of order when every operation has become shared habit. His name is preserved without attached events or specific stories. This silence reflects a reality. When everything proceeds by momentum, history no longer produces new markers, but quietly extends itself. When preservation becomes the primary aim, limits begin to surface. Order can no longer renew itself from within, but survives through repetition rather than inner vitality. In such conditions, even a small disturbance is enough to reveal the fragility that has been accumulating beneath a long surface of stability. The reign of Barsal Nuna comes to a close without signs of collapse or breakthrough. Kish remains standing, but the mechanism of succession has become the sole support for continuity. Everything persists in a state of suspension, neither advancing further nor yet falling apart. From here, Kish continues under Zamug in a fragile balance. Maintenance no longer arises from belief or inner momentum, but from a simpler reason. Nothing has yet emerged that is strong enough to replace what already exists. Zamug does not appear as a king of decisive action, nor is he remembered as a figure of upheaval. His reign survives in memory as an extension of what was already in place, a cautious prolongation in which power continues to operate through the inertia accumulated across many generations before him. The Sumerian king list still records the length of Zamug's reign in familiar numbers, but at this stage that length no longer conveys stability. It carries the tone of postponement, as if society stands before an unnamed crossroads, and therefore continues along a worn path simply because it is the only one available. Kish under Zamug does not descend into chaos, yet it is no longer flexible. Order is sustained by habit, by unease toward emptiness, and by the memory that things have always been this way. Power at this point does not need to assert itself, nor does it seek justification. It exists because it has not yet been truly tested. Zamug marks a moment when history seems to stand still within its own movement. There is no reform to drive it forward, and no crisis to bring it down. This stillness reflects a quiet fatigue. Order has lost the ability to adjust itself and no longer carries the energy to change. Reigns like that of Zamug rarely leave detailed traces. When all operation rests on inertia alone, history does not create new narratives but repeats itself, steadily lengthening until even the smallest shift becomes enough to slow the rhythm. From a state of quiet exhaustion, Kish moves into a different rhythm. Order is still present, but no longer seamless as before. What was once sustained through habit and continuity begins to reveal small gaps. Under Tizkar, the system no longer runs smoothly, but starts to emit faint signs of strain, signals that a change in direction is slowly taking shape. Tizkar is not described as the cause of crisis. Yet he cannot conceal that the system he inherits has come close to the limits of its endurance. Mechanisms that once operated almost automatically now require more frequent intervention, and with each intervention it becomes clearer that order has lost much of its former flexibility. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Tizkar's reign in the familiar long numbers, but at this stage that length carries a different tone, no longer a sign of durability, but the extension of a fragile condition. Order persists, yet the sense of certainty has faded. Kish under Tizkar is a society beginning to notice its cracks. They are not yet large enough to cause collapse, but they are sufficient to unsettle the belief that everything will sustain itself indefinitely. Power is no longer an unconscious habit, but a continuous effort to keep the structure from fracturing further. Tizkar represents the moment when Sumerian history becomes vulnerable. When order has worn down to this degree, every decision carries risk. To act too little allows the system to weaken on its own. To act too forcefully risks breaking the fragile balance that remains. Rule is no longer a choice between right and wrong, but between competing dangers. The Sumerians leave no detailed accounts of Tizkar's reign, and this silence itself reveals something essential. When a society no longer perceives a clear path forward, collective memory grows cautious. This reign exists as a transitional zone where inertia is no longer sufficient to carry the world onward, yet a true transformation has not fully taken shape. When Tizkar fades from the stream of memory, power in Kish has not collapsed, yet its continuity has become fragile. Order no longer shows only scattered surface cracks, but begins to waver from within its own structure. From this moment on, power is no longer confronting visible fractures alone, but gradually losing the ability to support itself. With Ilku, Sumerian memory records a phase unlike those before, one in which order is no longer sustained by habit, inertia, or temporary repairs, and the foundations that once held society upright begin to reveal their own instability. Ilku does not appear as a destroyer of the system, yet he can no longer rely on that system to rule with confidence. His reign exists in a state of disorientation, where power no longer knows what to lean on, tradition has worn thin, form has grown hollow, and succession no longer provides a sense of security. The Sumerian king list continues to record the length of Ilku's reign in its familiar rhythm. But within the current of memory, that length feels strange, not because it is excessive, but because it carries no accompanying sense of stability. Order remains present, yet it lacks a foundation firm enough to stand upon. Kish under Ilku is a society that begins to doubt its own order. When power can no longer explain its own existence, every rule becomes vulnerable to questioning. No open rebellion or visible collapse is required. Quiet doubt alone is enough to weaken a structure already worn by time. Ilku represents the moment when power loses its spiritual footing. There is no longer myth to legitimize it, no inertia to sustain it, and no form strong enough to conceal the emptiness within. Ruling at this stage is no longer about preserving order, but about confronting an absence of meaning. The Sumerians leave no detailed accounts of Ilku's reign, and this silence itself is revealing. It marks a period when history becomes difficult to narrate, when movement grows heavy and slow, as though society has paused to wait. Not quite for renewal, but for a sign that what still exists has finally reached the limit of its endurance. In this setting, replacement does not appear as reform or fine adjustment, but as a final attempt of the old power to stand upright before it begins to loosen its hold. From this point onward, power in Kish can no longer conceal its condition. Weakness becomes visible, no longer supported by habit or familiar forms. With Iltasadum, Sumerian memory records a particular moment, not a revival of order, but a final affirmation that the old order still exists, even if only for a very brief span of time. Iltasadum does not appear as a reformer, nor is he remembered as a destroyer. His reign carries the character of a last gathering as power draws together what remains, tradition, authority, and familiar patterns, to keep the system standing a little longer. The Sumerian king list records the length of Iltasadum's reign in its familiar rhythm. Yet here, that length signifies effort rather than stability. Order no longer operates naturally, nor does it retain enough flexibility to adapt. It survives through the will to preserve it, not through inner vitality. Kish under Iltasadum is a society that senses clearly that an era is approaching its end. No proclamation is needed, no great event required. It is enough to feel that power no longer opens toward the future, but merely prolongs the present. In such a context, every act of rule becomes more symbolic than transformative. Iltasadum represents the moment when power confronts its own limits. There is no longer any illusion of full recovery, nor hope of renewing order from within. What remains is the effort to prevent immediate collapse, so that transition, when it comes, does not arrive in complete chaos. The Sumerians leave no grand story about Iltasadum, and this is understandable. This is not a time of creation or tragedy, but of controlled withdrawal when power is not overthrown, but quietly steps away from the center of collective memory. As Iltasadum closes the recorded line, Kish no longer holds its former absolute position. Ahead lies a different form of authority, more explicit, more concrete, no longer sustained by the semi-mythic ambiguity of the past. From this long interval of silence, the name Enmebaragesi gradually emerges as a marker unlike those before him. Not because his reign was longer or shorter, nor because his story was more dramatic, but because his power is the first to step out of the haze of tradition. It is no longer preserved only in memory, but carved into stone, leaving traces in the material world, a new form of presence in which order takes on a shape that can be touched and confirmed by history. Before Enmebaragesi, kings existed in a world where time stretched endlessly, where power was recalled through symbols, and where history flowed without firm boundaries. With Enmebaragesi, this begins to change. His name is inscribed in stone. And once that happens, power is no longer merely remembered, it is verified. Enmebaragesi is the first king of Kish, whose existence can be confirmed by modern archaeology. This does not make him greater than those who came before, but it places him in a singular position where myth and history meet. From this point onward, the king no longer exists only in inherited memory, but stands as a human being who once walked upon real ground. In Sumerian memory, Enmebaragesi is not associated with ascents to the heavens, nor with reigns stretching into the superhuman. His authority does not depend on cosmic order or eternal cycles. It rests on presence, on a name that can be seen, read, and recognized again after many generations. Kish, under Enmebaragesi, is no longer the center of endless mythic cycles. It enters a different world, one in which city-states begin to compete. Power is measured through tangible influence, and memory is preserved not only by collective recall, but by material traces, inscriptions, and records. What matters is not that Enmebaragesi ends an era, but that he no longer fully belongs to the old one. He stands between two understandings of power, one still rooted in the space of the king list, the other already touching history in a concrete sense. At this boundary, Sumerian memory begins to turn. It no longer drifts entirely within myth, because power now leaves marks that can be recognized. And once such marks appear, the past is no longer only told, it can begin to be traced. From this turning point onward, Aga, the son of Enmebaragesi, enters Sumerian memory not as a founder, but as a sign that hereditary order has reached its limits. The authority he inherits from Kish still carries the title of supremacy, yet the natural acceptance once granted by other city-states has faded. Doubts begin to spread, signaling a phase in which power is no longer taken for granted, but increasingly subjected to scrutiny. If Enmebaragesi marks the moment when Kish's authority could still be confirmed through material traces, then, under Aga, that legacy begins to survive more through the language of tradition. It is recalled, invoked, and referenced, but no longer clearly reflected in the way the world functions day by day. Aga is not associated with great monuments, nor is he remembered for reform or expansion. His name appears primarily in texts of conflict, most notably with Uruk. And this alone reveals a quiet shift. When a king is defined largely by his rival, the center of power no longer rests securely in his hands. In Sumerian memory, Aga and Gilgamesh are not merely opposing figures. They embody two competing understandings of power. Kish under Aga still stands upon inheritance, authority as a principle extended through king lists. Uruk, by contrast, begins to express a different model, power tied to the city, to dense population, to walls, and to the ability to organize social life on an ever larger scale. By Aga's time, Kish is no longer the sole center capable of imposing influence across southern Mesopotamia. Trade routes shift, Uruk expands rapidly, and new forms of organization prove more effective in mobilizing people and resources. In this setting, power can no longer be inherited once and sustained by the inertia of the past. Texts suggest that Aga attempts to maintain supremacy through demands and threats. But Uruk's response introduces something new. Refusal no longer unfolds in silence. It becomes a public act, and this marks a crucial change. An order once considered self-evident begins to be openly questioned, without being immediately crushed. From this moment on, power is no longer measured primarily by the authority of the past, but by the ability to sustain consensus and effectiveness in everyday reality. This does not erase Aga from history, but it places him in a different position, as a figure standing at the boundary between two eras. Aga is not weak enough to be forgotten, yet not strong enough to restore Kish's central dominance, and his name endures not in celebration, but as a marker of transition between power as inherited law and power as a structure that must continually prove itself through organization, economy, and social mobilization. After Aga, Kish continues to exist, but no longer leads the collective memory of Sumer. The historical center quietly shifts. The endlessly stretched numbers fade from remembrance, replaced by concrete conflicts, clearer political choices, and decisions that can be reversed by circumstance. Power is no longer felt as an eternal rhythm, but as a structure directly shaped by human action and the pressures of its time. This shift does not take the form of a sudden collapse. It unfolds as a slow withdrawal of an order that has exhausted its ability to sustain itself, leaving behind a void that is difficult to name. From that void, a new need gradually takes shape, not to replace power through force, but to re-establish the reason why power might be accepted at all. It is within this space of quiet reconfiguration that Meskiagasha appears, as Uruk begins to enter the center of Sumerian memory, with a rhythm entirely its own. He does not enter memory as a conquering king. There are no signs of territorial expansion, no stories of military victory. Meskiagasha is remembered instead as the one who lays the groundwork for a different form of legitimacy, where power no longer rests on the inheritance of an old order, but on the ability to bind people, city, and world into a single, meaningful structure. Ancient traditions describe Meskiagasha as the son of Utu, the sun god. This detail is not meant to elevate him through spectacle. In Sumerian thought, the sun embodies justice, order, and the capacity to distinguish clearly between right and wrong, light and darkness. When a king is directly linked to Utu, it suggests that his authority does not need to be proven through military success, but is legitimized through harmony with cosmic order. This understanding is especially significant as Uruk begins to rise. After the weakening of Kish, no single hegemonic center remains strong enough to stand naturally above the other city-states. Uruk cannot simply inherit an old title. It requires a new foundation to assert its position, and that foundation cannot rely on force alone. Meskiagasha represents an attempt to redefine power at its roots before any visible expansion takes place. Memory associates him with the image of entering the mountain and then emerging from the mountain. In Sumerian thought, the mountain is the threshold between the human world and the divine realm. Meskiagasha's passage into and out of that space does not signify conquest. It is an act of confirmation, the Batika, that political power must be situated within an order larger than itself, extending beyond the individual and even beyond the city-state. Under Meskiagasha, Uruk begins to form a distinct identity. It is no longer merely an expanding population center, but gradually becomes a sacred space where political authority, religious ritual, and social organization converge. Power is no longer simply held or inherited. It is interpreted, presented, and maintained through order itself. Unlike the kings of Kish before him, Meskiagasha is not remembered through long lists of achievements. His role lies at the foundational level. He does not complete Uruk, nor does he raise it to its height, but he creates the conditions necessary for Uruk to become a center of power for generations to come. From this point onward, the stories of Sumerian kings begin to shift in focus. They no longer ask only who ruled and for how long, but how that power was understood and accepted. Authority is no longer assumed by default. It must be placed within a structure of shared meaning. Meskiagasha therefore does not appear as a loud or dominant figure in Sumerian memory. He represents a necessary pause, a moment when Uruk has not yet entered its most forceful phase, but has already moved beyond the invisibility of power. Upon this quiet foundation, more resonant names will soon emerge: Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh, figures who not only expand Uruk's model of authority, but also test and reveal the inner limits of the very structure taking shape. If Aga marks the end of Kish as an order that has exhausted its ability to sustain itself, then Meskiagasha opens the beginning of Uruk through a different understanding of power. It is not built on direct imposition, but shaped through order, symbol, and the capacity to organize human life within a shared yet unfinished structure. On this foundation, authority in Uruk does not erupt through conquest, nor does it assert itself through a single decisive event. Instead, it moves into another rhythm, clearer, more stable, and at the same time more complex. Enmerkar enters the stream of memory within this context, not as one who shakes the world, but as one who causes the world to begin functioning in a form that can be repeated. The name Enmerkar does not resonate because of the length of his reign or a catalogue of victories. He is remembered for the way power under his rule is arranged, distributed, and sustained in everyday life. With Enmerkar, authority no longer depends entirely on the physical presence of the king. It begins to exist as a system. The epics associated with Enmerkar rarely center on the battlefield. Instead, they revolve around Uruk as a whole, walls being raised, rituals repeated, messengers traveling back and forth, and messages that must be transmitted with precision. This is not the absence of conflict, but a shift in focus. Power is no longer narrated primarily through individual action, but through the way a city is organized and maintained. The walls of Uruk in memory are not merely defensive structures. They mark a deeper boundary between a space that has been ordered and a surrounding world not yet fully placed within that order. Once power takes root in such a fixed space, it no longer moves with the body of the ruler. Uruk becomes an anchor, a place where order can continue even when the king is absent. Another central element in the memory of Enmerkar is language. Traditions recount that messages between Uruk and distant regions gradually become too complex to be carried fully by human memory alone. It is in this context that writing emerges, again not as a purely technical invention, but as a new instrument of power. When speech is inscribed, command no longer relies on voice or direct presence. It can travel farther, endure longer, and be understood in the same way by those who have never met the one who issued it. Power from this point on is not only exercised in the moment, but preserved and repeated. This shift carries deep significance. Authority begins to detach from the individual and attach itself to systems, to conventions, structures, and an emerging collective memory. Enmerkar represents, in Sumerian remembrance, the moment when order no longer needs to be re-established each day. It can sustain itself. Under his reign, Uruk is no longer merely a concentration of people. It becomes an entity capable of organizing itself. There are shared rituals, implicitly understood roles, and a relatively unified sense of social order. The epics show Enmerkar ruling over a world of diverse languages and customs. Yet power is not depicted as erasing difference, but as the capacity to arrange and integrate, maintaining order through continuous adjustment rather than destruction. After Enmerkar, Uruk is no longer just a strong city-state. It becomes a model. Subsequent kings, whether they expand, test, or unsettle that order, operate within the space Enmerkar has shaped. Sumerian power from this point forward takes on the form of a civilization tied to the city, to structure, to law, and to the capacity to sustain social life beyond the span of a single human lifetime. If Meskiagasha grants Uruk cosmic legitimacy, then Enmerkar gives it a recognizable form. He does not expand the world through the sword, but through walls, writing, and the idea that order can be built, preserved, and transmitted across time. From this movement, Sumerian power departs from the framework of personal authority and becomes a system with memory, capable of continuing even as individual rulers pass out of time. As this structure gradually stabilizes, its inner limits also begin to surface, not loudly or abruptly, but through quiet gaps that cannot be easily filled, moments where order can no longer shield human beings from their inherent fragility. From these fissures, Lugal Banda enters Sumerian memory as a response to what the system itself cannot resolve, opening a phase in which power must confront questions that lie beyond the very structure that created it. He does not enter memory as a victor. On the contrary, the traditions tell that Lugal Banda is the one left behind, sick, exhausted, separated from the army, and from the familiar rhythm of communal life. This detail is not incidental. In Sumerian storytelling, to be left behind is to be pushed outside of order, outside of ritual, outside the protection that allows a person to belong to the world. Lugalbanda's illness, therefore, carries a meaning deeper than personal misfortune. It places him in a liminal state, where former identity no longer holds and a new one has not yet emerged. This is a dangerous space in ancient memory, where many figures disappear without trace. At that moment, Lugalbanda is no longer securely part of Uruk. It is within this silence that metaphysical elements appear in the tradition. Lugalbanda is aided, restored, and granted extraordinary mobility. Yet the center of these stories is not the miracle itself, it is transformation. When he returns from abandonment, he does not come back as the same person. He returns with a different experience of limits, of the fragility of order, and of the relationship between humans and forces beyond their control. Lugalbanda comes back to Uruk without spoils or imposed authority. He carries acknowledgement instead. From one who was cast out of the community, he becomes one who is received again. Power, as it gathers around him, does not arise from position or violence, but from having crossed a state in which order could offer no protection. His presence marks a subtle shift in how the Sumerians imagine the king. Where authority had previously been tied to innate divinity or to the capacity to organize society, in Lugalbanda it becomes linked to inner transformation. The king is no longer only the center of order, but someone who has passed through disorder and returned, changed, more cautious, deeper, and more aware of his own limits. In some traditions, Lugalbanda is remembered as the father of Gilgamesh. This connection is not merely genealogical, it is symbolic. Lugalbanda becomes a bridge between kings defined by structure and divine legitimacy, and epic figures marked by pronounced human depth. Through him, Sumerian memory begins to pay closer attention to the human being behind power, with fear, weakness, and the capacity for change. For this reason, Lugalbanda is not remembered for the length of his reign or for material traces left behind. He endures in collective memory because he entered darkness without being consumed by it. In a world where power is often linked to domination, this image opens another possibility. Power as the capacity to endure, adapt, and return to the community in a more profound state of being. If Lugalbanda opens reflection on the inner qualities of kingship, then Dumuzid carries that reflection deeper into the collective consciousness. He does not appear as a conqueror or as a builder of order through laws and monuments, but as a bond between power and the living world, where rulership aligns with the rhythms of land, seasons, growth, and decline. At this intersection, power no longer separates human beings from the world they inhabit, but becomes part of a cadence the community must listen to and adapt itself to. In the king list, Dumuzid is recorded as King of Uruk. Yet in religious and literary memory, he is also a sacred figure, the divine shepherd, the consort of Inanna. This overlap between king and deity is not a confusion. For Sumer's agricultural society, supreme authority did not lie in the ability to command, but in securing the continuity of life itself. Water arriving in season, soil retaining moisture, herds multiplying. Dumuzid becomes a condensed image of these conditions of existence. His power, therefore, does not operate through decree or control. It manifests through participation in natural cycles. When Dumuzid remains in the world of light, the land blossoms, When he departs, barrenness spreads. His disappearance is not understood as failure or punishment, but as an inevitable part of cosmic order, where life can only continue through recurring interruption. Sumerian laments recount Dumuzid being drawn down into the underworld, separated from the human world. Inanna mourns, the community mourns. Rituals are established to remember this loss. In these stories, the king does not stand apart from society's pain. He carries it within his own fate. Power is no longer the ability to shield people from suffering, but the capacity to endure suffering together as part of a shared order from which no one is exempt. Dumuzid thus becomes a king of absence. Unlike predecessors remembered for what they built or preserved, he is remembered for what is no longer present. This absence is not abstract. It touches human life directly. Failed harvests, cracked fields, the recurring anxiety of each passing year. Each time the land turns dry, the memory of Dumuzid is invoked, not in praise, but in acceptance that life is inseparable from loss. With Dumuzid, power is no longer understood as the ability to keep order fixed in place. It becomes the ability to accept the cyclical nature of the world. The king is not the one who prevents death, but the one who enters it so that life may return according to its own rhythm. Order is no longer a static condition, but a familiar movement between presence and disappearance, like the changing seasons themselves. After Dumuzid, Sumerian memory does not abandon this model. Lamentation rituals continue for centuries, showing that Dumuzid has moved beyond the title of a historical king to become part of the collective spiritual life. He belongs not only to Uruk, but to every sowing season, every drought, and every quiet hope for the return of green. Dumuzid is not remembered through victory. He is preserved in memory through his repeated withdrawal. In a world where life depends intimately on earth, water, and weather, this image leaves behind a very quiet truth. There are forms of power that do not exist by asserting themselves, but by accepting disappearance, so that life may continue in its own enduring rhythm. Dumuzid binds power to the repeating rhythm of birth and death, where human life merges with the unending cycles of nature. From that deep layer, the story continues to widen and move further still, turning directly toward the ultimate limit of humanity. Gilgamesh enters the narrative not as one who has conquered death, but as one who dares to approach it and must live with the consequences that such an attempt leaves behind. In the king list, Gilgamesh is recorded plainly, king of Uruk, builder of its walls, ruling for a finite span of time. Yet in cultural memory, he becomes an open question, not because he is stronger than all others, but because he is the one who looks directly at the point where every form of power must come to a halt. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. This formula is not meant to glorify him, but to reveal an inner tension. He carries extraordinary strength, unyielding will, and almost no equal. Yet within that very superiority, a paradox emerges. No matter how great power becomes, it cannot erase death. Gilgamesh can subdue people, but he cannot subdue time. In his earliest portrayal, Sumerian memory does not idealize him. Gilgamesh rules through force, imposing his will upon Uruk like an untamed natural force. His power exists, but it is not yet understood. And for that reason, Enkidu appears, not merely as a companion, but as a living limit. For the first time, Gilgamesh encounters an equal, not to be defeated, but to be reflected. Through his bond with Enkidu, Gilgamesh begins to step away from the absolute position of power. He learns to see himself from the outside, to recognize that strength does not reside only in domination, but in the presence of another. And just as this balance begins to form, it is abruptly broken. The death of Enkidu is not a secondary event, it is the axis upon which the entire story turns. For the first time, a Sumerian king confronts neither military defeat nor the collapse of order, but a loss that cannot be reversed. Death does not negotiate, does not delay, and cannot be subdued. Every form of power Gilgamesh has known becomes powerless before it. From that moment on, Gilgamesh no longer acts as a ruler. He becomes a human being attempting to flee finitude itself. His quest for immortality is not an effort to extend power, but an attempt to escape the fear that has taken hold of him. This is the first time in Sumerian memory that a king is described not through strength, but through terror in the face of death. Gilgamesh does not find what he seeks, he does not attain immortality, and it is precisely this failure that secures his place in memory. Sumer remembers Gilgamesh not because he lived forever, but because he accepted that he could not. When he returns to Uruk, he brings back no secret of eternal life, only a quiet understanding. There are limits that cannot be crossed, and recognizing them is what makes a human being whole. At this point, Gilgamesh's power changes form. It no longer lies in surpassing the world, but in returning to it as it is. The walls of Uruk, the achievement noted in the king list, become the final symbol, because they protect people from death, but because they represent what humans can do within limited time, build, remember, and leave behind traces sturdy enough for others to live within. Gilgamesh, therefore, becomes more than the king of Uruk. He becomes the first written voice to affirm that power cannot save humanity from death, but can teach humanity how to live alongside its own finitude. In a world where kings are often deified, this image endures not because of immortality, but because of the acceptance of limits. From that moment onward, the tone of the narrative about power begins to soften. The great stories do not disappear, but they are no longer pushed further. Attempts to transcend human limits gradually come to a close, and journeys toward the boundary between life and death no longer appear. The king list continues, but with a different rhythm, more concise, more reserved, as if history has stepped away from the epic realm and returned to the familiar circulation of power in everyday life. The kings who follow in Uruk emerge within a very different atmosphere. Urnungal, Udul-Kalama, Labashum, Ennun-Tarahana, Meshe, Melam-Ana, and Lugal-Kitun are not surrounded by dense layers of meaning. They are not tied to events of cosmic scale, nor do they become the center of stories told again and again. And in Sumerian memory, this very absence conveys something essential. The silence of memory is not a sign of decline, it is a sign of stability. Uruk, after Gilgamesh, has become a mature city-state, one in which power no longer needs to be explained through divine origin or metaphysical trials. The king now exists as part of an established order, no longer as the point around which the entire world revolves. Urnungal and Udul-Kalama represent the first generation of rulers living in the shadow of an overwhelming symbol. They cannot and do not need to repeat Gilgamesh. Their role is not to expand memory, but to prevent it from fracturing. Power is measured through steady operation, grain distributed on time, rituals observed in season, and relations with other city-states maintained within limits safe enough to avoid major conflict. The names that follow pass like a steady current. There is no sign of total crisis and no moment of eruption. This suggests that Uruk has entered another phase, one in which power no longer needs to be narrated because it has become habitual. Order no longer has to be created anew each time, but is quietly sustained across time. Lugal-Kitun, who closes the list of Uruk's kings in this period, does not appear as the end of an era. He stands at a threshold, where memory begins to shift its focus. Not because Uruk collapses, but because the surrounding world has grown denser and more complex, with multiple city-states coexisting, competing, and seeking to assert their own positions. The kings after Gilgamesh, therefore, do not lack significance, they lack myth. And this absence reflects a crucial historical transition, the moment when society no longer needs a hero to understand itself, when power no longer requires justification through stories that reach beyond human life. From this point on, the current of memory moves at a slower, steadier pace. Attention no longer centers on the fate of singular individuals, but on how city-states maintain themselves through administration, distribution, and stability. The king gradually merges into the broader apparatus, no longer the center of the story, but a component within a functioning structure. History, as a result, no longer rises toward dramatic climax, but stretches outward like a continuous flow, where quiet regularity, rarely noticed, becomes the true sign of endurance. In this state, power no longer needs the language of epic to be recognized. It quietly changes form, affirmed instead by what can be seen, measured, and touched in everyday life. Mesanapada appears at this point of transition not as the founder of a new myth, but as a sign that power has entered the material world. Before Mesanapada, Sumerian authority existed largely in spoken tradition, in lists of names and in memory passed from one generation to the next. Under his rule, power begins to leave unmistakable traces in the ground itself. Ur is no longer merely a river city, but gradually becomes a true political center, a place where order is organized around lasting institutions and reinforced by material forms capable of outliving a human lifespan. The royal tombs of Ur, unprecedented in scale and elaboration, reflect a profound shift in how the Sumerians understood kingship. These are not simply places of rest. They are carefully arranged structures layered with gold, precious stones, musical instruments, ceremonial vehicles, and human offerings. Each material layer reveals the capacity to mobilize labor, control resources, and sustain order on a large scale, achievements impossible through symbols or narrative alone. Here, power does not end with death. It continues through burial ritual, through the repetition of form, and through memory anchored to specific places. The king is no longer remembered only for what he accomplished in life, but for what remains after his presence has vanished. Order, in this way, is not interrupted, but extended in visible form. The image of the king under Mesanapada also changes. He is no longer primarily a mediator between gods and humans, as in the memory of Uruk. Instead, he becomes a focal point of wealth, ritual, and economic authority. His titles still invoke the divine, but legitimacy no longer rests chiefly on sacred descent. It rests on visible wealth, on accumulated surplus, and on its controlled distribution within increasingly defined frameworks. Under Mesanapada, controls vital trade routes linking inland Mesopotamia with the Gulf region. Barley, metals, rare stones, and skilled labor do more than sustain society. They become the foundation of political power. The king rules not only people but the movement of materials. The ability to regulate these flows creates a new form of stability, quiet but enduring. The rise of reveals a subtle transformation in social consciousness. Power now carries a clear sense of inheritance. Death does not collapse order, but becomes part of it. Tombs are no longer endpoints, but instruments for reinforcing dynastic memory and confirming continuity. Order no longer needs to be retold through long narratives. It is maintained through ritual, material presence, and repetition. Masanapada, therefore, is not preserved in memory as an epic hero. He is remembered as the one who established a different understanding of power, power rooted in accumulation, in material symbols, and in structures capable of enduring across generations. Here, authority does not rise above human life. It is embedded in what people use, exchange, and safeguard each day. From into Masanapada, the Sumerian world enters another phase in which politics, economy, and ritual no longer exist as separate domains, but intertwine within the structure of a city-state growing through administration and surplus. Power at this stage is not merely felt. It can be seen in the accumulation of wealth, the maintenance of ritual, and the daily organization of order itself. Yet, this new visibility did not guarantee lasting solidity. After Masanapada, remained wealthy and retained the appearance of a great center. Surplus continued to accumulate, rituals were still performed, and the memory of its rise had not yet faded. But beneath this surface of stability, the sense of certainty began to blur, like ground that trembles faintly before visible cracks appear. 3 successive names, Meskiagnuna, Elulu, and Balulu, enter the king list with notably short reigns. This rapid turnover speaks more clearly than any detailed narrative. When power changes hands too frequently, collective memory can no longer anchor order to a single figure. What remains is not the image of individual kings, but the impression of a system forced to move too quickly to keep its balance. Meskiagnuna inherited not only wealth, but the pressure of an increasingly complex structure. The material surplus accumulated under Masanapada demanded constant maintenance. Grain had to be carefully managed, trade routes protected, and the fragile balance between elites and labor preserved. When power rests on large accumulation, it no longer operates lightly. A single weak point is enough to unsettle the whole. The brevity of Meskiagnuna's reign reflects that pressure. Authority could no longer rely on inheritance alone. It required uninterrupted coordination, and when that coordination faltered, instability surfaced, quietly, yet clearly, in a rhythm of leadership change. Elulu appears in much the same context. His name passes through Sumerian memory without a distinct trace. Yet this very absence is telling. Power had become a temporary position rather than a stable role. The king no longer had time to become a symbol. He simply filled a gap before order shifted once again. Balulu, closing this sequence of short reigns, marks a moment when Ur's momentum seems to have thinned. No major reforms are remembered, no decisive victories recorded. The once brilliant city now resembles a center, struggling to hold its place in a Sumerian world that had grown more competitive, more fluid, and harder to contain. These 3 brief reigns do not show defeated by a single rival. They reveal power eroding from within, worn down by increasing administrative strain, by the complexity of a wealthy society, and by a political landscape where no city-state could remain static without cost. The fragility did not stem from scarcity, but from the very complexity that material power had produced. It is within this period of quiet shaking that another approach begins to form alongside it. Lagash does not rise through display or dazzling accumulation. It does not build authority through monumental symbols or grand ritual. Instead, it advances slowly, placing emphasis on administration, clear records, defined land boundaries, and concrete rules for an economic and social life growing ever more intertwined. This contrast reflects a crucial shift in the Sumerian world. No single center can any longer impose its order across the land. Multiple models of power now coexist, each testing its own durability, or with its imposing yet fragile legacy, and Lagash with its restrained, disciplined, and methodical way of governing. It was precisely this choice that gave power in Lagash a different character. It no longer depended on displays of wealth or memories of a former golden age, but rested instead on more durable foundations, administration, law, and a clear awareness of territory. From this turning point, the focus of Sumerian history shifted once again, moving away from the world of symbols and stepping deeper into the space of bureaucratic order and writing. Ur-Namshi laid the groundwork for this model. Under his rule, Lagash entered memory not as the richest city-state, but as an organized community. Stone inscriptions recording the construction of temples, the digging of canals, and the reinforcement of infrastructure reveal a form of power tied directly to everyday life. The king appears not only in ritual, but in the coordination of labor, irrigation, and resources, the very elements that determined survival in an agricultural society. With the Anatum, power in Lagash moved to another level, a clear consciousness of boundaries. He is remembered not through long heroic epics, but through reliefs and texts describing territorial disputes with Umma. Here, warfare is not told as the journey of a hero, but as the collision of fields, canals, and boundary markers. Authority is legitimized by defining who owns which land, and that definition is carved in stone so it cannot be forgotten. The inscriptions from Eannatum's reign reveal a crucial shift in political thinking. The king appears as the guardian of a divinely sanctioned order, yet that order is no longer abstract. It exists in visible lines on the ground. Once words are carved into stone, memory no longer depends on oral tradition. It becomes evidence, something that can be seen, cited, and used to preserve order over time. Enannatum I inherited a structure already in place. His role was not to expand at all costs, but to ensure continuity. Administrative records show Lagash entering a phase of sustained governance, where power no longer needed spectacle. It lived in laws, in customary practice, and in the steady rhythm of daily record-keeping. Under Entemena, the Lagash model reached maturity. His inscriptions do not focus solely on victories or disputes, but emphasize reconciliation and the re-establishment of balance. Boundaries are reaffirmed, laws strengthened, and order placed above display. Power is no longer measured by triumph or defeat, but by the ability to prevent conflict from returning. What set Lagash apart was not overwhelming military strength, but an early legal consciousness. While many other city-states still relied on the personal authority of the king, Lagash built power as a system with memory carved into stone, placed in public space, and no longer dependent on a single individual. For this reason, Lagash is not preserved in history through tales of immortality or moments of epic grandeur. It is remembered for the endurance of its administration. Here, Order did not need to be retold repeatedly to assert itself. It was measured, recorded, and anchored in land, water, and concrete law. In an increasingly fragmented Sumerian landscape, Lagash demonstrated that stability could endure not through symbolic radiance, but through a steady operating structure, where authority became a familiar part of daily life and continued quietly, without spectacle. As this mode of organization spread and began to be shared among multiple city-states, such as Lagash, Uruk, and Uruk, the overall picture slowly changed. These once separate structures no longer existed as closed, parallel worlds. A new form of domination began to take shape, not meant to reinforce existing orders, but to rise above them. The emergence of Sargon marks the moment when the Sumerian city-states were, for the first time, placed within a single overarching framework, broader, more centralized, and marked by the cool logic of unified power. From this point on, Sumerian history was no longer shaped primarily by individual cities with their own patron gods, laws, and memories. It was gradually drawn into a larger order where power did not rest on the internal stability of each city-state, but on the ability to impose unity across the entire Mesopotamian landscape. In Sumerian memory, this change did not unfold as a gentle transition. It carried the feeling of a rupture, quiet, restrained, yet unmistakable. There was no shared ritual to legitimize the new order, no slow-building consensus among the old centers. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. Power could be established from outside the traditional city-state system and still endure. This unsettled the very foundations of Sumerian political life. From the divine nature of kingship to laws carved in stone to carefully defined notions of territory. Even the way memory tells the story of Sargon's origins reflects this difference. He is not tied to an ancient city or a long-standing divine lineage. Tradition emphasizes his humble beginnings, a child set adrift, carried by the river, raised at the margins of the old order. This story is not meant to glorify destiny, but to assert that the new power did not need Sumerian memory in order to justify itself. Sargon did not become king of Sumer in the way earlier rulers had been. Instead, he placed Sumer within a larger structure. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Kish ceased to function as autonomous centers with distinct memories. They became units within an expanding system. Power was no longer anchored in city walls or local ritual, but in a standing army and the ability to control territory on an unprecedented scale. A crucial aspect of this transformation lay in organization and language. Under the new order, Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian in administration and political life. This was not merely a change in communication, it was a change in how the world was named, measured, and governed. As administrative language shifted, collective memory began to shift with it, slowly but irreversibly. Sargon did not erase Sumerian culture. Writing, ritual, and the gods continued to exist, but they no longer occupied the center. They were folded into a different power structure, one in which Sumer ceased to be a political subject and became a cultural layer beneath the functioning Akkadian order above it. This absorption is what made the domination so profound. Sumer was not destroyed, it was overlaid. For the first time, the Sumerians were no longer the sole narrators of their own story. They became part of a much larger narrative, written according to a different logic, the logic of empire. Power no longer required the consent of each city-state. It depended on military maintenance, taxation, and the control of space on an ever-expanding scale. For this reason, Sargon stands not only as a successful ruler, but as a historical boundary. Before him, the Sumerian world existed as a network of competing city-states sharing a common culture. After his rise, Mesopotamia entered the age of structures that transcended the city itself, where history began to operate on a different level, more abstract, less intimate. In Sumerian memory, Sargon is not preserved through closeness, but through the irreversible mark he left behind. From this turning point onward, Sumer no longer held political centrality, even as its writing, rituals, and memories continued to endure quietly, layered beneath the Akkadian world that ruled above them. From this foundation, the Akkadian Empire no longer carried the feeling of a beginning. It entered a phase of self-operation where the structures already in place continued to expand and sustain themselves. It was within this steady motion that the deepest changes to the Sumerian world began to unfold. The kings who followed no longer stood between old and new, but governed an order that was already defined, broader, heavier, and increasingly distant from the political logic Sumer had shaped over centuries. Rimush opened this phase through suppression. Rebellions in the Sumerian cities revealed that Akkadian unity did not arise from cultural agreement. It was maintained through continuous military force. Imperial authority could not assume acceptance. It had to be asserted again and again, not as an emergency response, but as a permanent condition for the new order to survive. This marked a decisive shift. Under Akkadian rule, power no longer rested on the bond between a city and its patron deity, nor on the collective memory of each community. It depended on rapid response, effective coercion, and sustained control across a wide territory, one where the old centers no longer held decisive weight. Under Manishtushu, the empire grew more administratively stable. Texts show the expansion of royal and elite land ownership under Akkadian authority. Power was no longer anchored in Uruk, Ur, or Lagash, but in a more abstract center, a place from which commands were issued, recorded, and enforced at a distance. Land was no longer experienced as the ground of a specific community, but as space that could be measured, allocated, and managed. At this stage, Sumer was still present, but no longer politically central. The Sumerian script continued in use, yet increasingly in service of an order that no longer carried a Sumerian spirit. The old city-states did not vanish, but their roles narrowed. Power had moved away from the city and into the imperial frame. The most profound turning point came under Naram-Sin. For the first time in Mesopotamia, a king declared himself a god while still alive. This act was more than personal ambition. It revealed a structural need. When power could no longer be anchored in the local gods of individual cities, it required a new center. Naram-Sin placed himself there, turning imperial authority into a form of power without intermediaries. From that moment on, Akkadian order no longer operated through the familiar network of local deities known to the Sumerians. It functioned through the image of the king as the direct embodiment of power. This made the political structure more centralized, but also more distant from the spiritual life that had long grounded Sumerian society. By this point, Sumer had almost entirely withdrawn from political agency. Akkadian increasingly dominated administration and authority. Sumerian writing remained, but as a cultural and ritual medium, no longer as the language of decision. The Sumerians still prayed, still recorded, still preserved memory, but they no longer shaped the order of the world around them. Shari inherited an empire that had moved far from its original balance. Under his reign, internal and external pressures began to erode the Akkadian structure. Yet even as the empire weakened, Sumer did not return to its former position. The age of independent city-states had closed. The world reflected in the Sumerian king list was no longer a reality that could be fully restored. Across these reigns, Sumer's retreat unfolded quietly. There was no single moment of collapse, only a gradual shift in power, language, and the way the world was organized. Sumer was not erased, it was pushed into a deeper layer, where memory endured but no longer decided. From this point onward, Sumer no longer appears as an independent political actor. It settles into the role of a foundational culture, a deep layer beneath successive empires. Its script continues to be learned as a sacred language, its rituals still performed, but history now moves within larger structures, following a different rhythm. In this silent withdrawal, Sumer reaches another mode of existence, no longer present through domination, but through memory, enduring, quiet, and more lasting than any empire that rose above it. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed, Mesopotamia did not immediately find a replacement order. The old centers were still there but scattered. Concentrated power had vanished while a new structure had yet to take shape. This was not a moment of total collapse, but a prolonged gap, a stretch of time in which society continued to function in a state of fatigue, while the memory of empire had not yet faded. It was within this unsettled space that Ur-Nammu emerged, not as a conqueror promising renewed glory, but as someone attempting to mend a world that had been stretched for too long. Ur-Nammu did not seek to return Sumer to the age of epic kings. He understood that this logic had closed. After empire, after oppression, and after the disintegration of an overextended power, society no longer needed, and no longer trusted, forms of legitimacy rooted in myth. What was needed instead was an order that could actually function in everyday life. Power, therefore, had to become clearer, more limited, and subject to control. Under Ur-Nammu, Ur once again assumed a central role. But this was no longer a center of sacred memory or symbolic splendor. It was an administrative center. Authority was no longer justified by divine selection, but by how society was organized. The clearest expression of this shift was the law code bearing his name. Not a metaphysical decree, but an effort to establish a framework for human behavior. The law code of Ur-Nammu reveals a new understanding of justice. Offenses were defined, punishment standardized, and the language itself became more secular in tone. Law was no longer a direct extension of divine will. It became a tool to limit arbitrariness, including the arbitrariness of the king. Order was maintained not through fear of the sacred, but through rules that could be written down, learned, and applied. Alongside the law, administration was reorganized. Administrative texts show a highly standardized system for distributing labor, grain, and obligations. The king did not stand outside this system as a transcendent figure. He stood at its summit as a coordinator. Power, in this form, was functional rather than symbolic, less mythic but more stable. Notably, Ur-Nammu did not erase the legacy of Akkad. The administrative techniques, record-keeping practices, and territorial organization developed under the empire continued to be used, but they were placed within a different framework. Where Akkad had used these tools to expand power beyond Sumer, Ur-Nammu used them to restrain ambition, reinforce internal order, and redefined Sumer's role in a changed world. At this stage, Sumerian memory no longer revolved around questions of immortality or the limits of human existence. The concern became simpler and more practical: how to prevent society from continuing to fall apart. Power was no longer something astonishing or worthy of reverence. It was something necessary, and therefore something that had to be bound. Ur-Nammu did not restore Sumer in its old sense. He transformed it. Under his reign, Sumer did not regain absolute centrality in history, but reached a different condition, a society governed by law, administration, and a clear awareness of the limits of power. This was not a peak, but a fragile balance, achieved after centuries of experimentation, collapse, and restructuring. And at this turning point, the narrative of Sumer settles into a quieter rhythm. Myth no longer resonates, and ambitions of domination no longer occupy the center. What remains is a sober effort to extend the life of order a little longer before history moves on once again, carrying with it new forms of organization, increasingly distant from the place where everything once began. From these conditions, Ur-Nammu emerged as the one who rebuilt the skeletal framework of order after the Akkadian Age. Upon that foundation, Shulgi took over and made the structure truly function. Under his reign, the Sumerian world entered its final moment of renewal, not brilliant in a mythic sense, but durable in terms of organization, discipline, and administrative capacity on a scale never achieved before. Shulgi did not rule as a king searching for fragile balance. He ruled as an architect of systems. His long reign allowed reforms not only to be proclaimed, but to be slowly absorbed into everyday life. Administrative records from the Ur-III period reveal a state apparatus that operated with continuity and precision. Labor was assigned according to plan, rations were meticulously recorded, and obligations were standardized across social groups. The state no longer waited for crisis in order to respond. It actively organized society from the ground up. The clearest mark of Shulgi's rule was standardization. Systems of weight and measurement were unified, ritual calendars were synchronized. The training of scribes became a clearly structured process. These changes show that power no longer depended on the personal abilities of the king, but on the capacity to sustain an order that could be repeated accurately over time. Under Shulgi, Sumer ceased to be a loose collection of local traditions and became a highly synchronized administrative space. Shulgi also understood the importance of the image of power. He allowed himself to be praised and even deified in hymns. But unlike earlier attempts at divinization, this was not meant to replace the system with the individual. It was meant to reinforce the system. Shulgi did not stand outside the law. He stood at its center as a symbol of smooth operation. Power here carried both sacred resonance and practical function, and the two were tightly interwoven. During his reign, networks of roads, relay stations, and storage facilities expanded significantly. Information, people, and goods moved faster and under greater control. This was the mark of a mature state, one in which power was no longer tied to a single city, but to the ability to manage a vast and complex space stretching across multiple regions. Yet at this very level of refinement, limits also began to show. The more sophisticated the system became, the more it depended on uninterrupted stability. Any disruption, from climate shifts, external pressure, or warfare, could trigger cascading effects that were difficult to contain. Shulgi built a machine that functioned with remarkable efficiency, but one that required constant energy to remain in motion. For this reason, Shulgi's reign carries a distinctive feeling in Sumerian history, the feeling of completeness. This was no longer an experiment, but not yet decline. It was the moment when Sumer, after centuries of upheaval, demonstrated that it could function as a fully developed state by ancient standards, with law, administration, control, and clearly defined ambition. After Shulgi, this order continued for a time, but the moment of balance did not repeat itself. His successors inherited a system too intricate to sustain easily in a world that was changing rapidly and growing ever more unpredictable. Shulgi, therefore, is not remembered as the one who opened a new future. He is remembered as the one who brought Sumer to the highest limit of what it could become. Under his reign, this world did not return to myth, nor did it transform into a new kind of empire. It reached maturity, and that very completeness quietly signaled that Sumer, as an independent order, was approaching its final chapters. From this summit, history did not collapse at once. Sumer continued to exist, but in a state of strain, like a structure perfected to the point where it could no longer easily adjust itself. Continuity persisted in silence, without the drive to expand. The last three kings of the Ur-3 dynasty therefore did not inherit a growing order, but took charge of a system that had reached the limits of its own endurance, where every effort to preserve stability also exposed the fragility beneath. Amar-Sin ascended the throne in a world that still appeared stable on the surface. The administrative apparatus continued to function, granaries were still recorded, and rituals followed their established calendar. Yet this stability was no longer natural. It had to be sustained with increasing intensity. Administrative texts reveal rising labor pressure, denser coordination, and a shrinking margin of flexibility for local communities. The order that had once been Sumer's strength began to turn into a burden. A system that was too precise could no longer adapt easily when conditions changed. Under Amar-Sin, power took on the form of constant control. The state had to intervene more frequently just to maintain the same level of stability. This revealed a paradox that had already taken shape. The more order was required, the more energy the system consumed to preserve itself. Sumer did not lack laws or administration. What it lacked was room to breathe. Shu-Sin inherited a state that was now forced to confront threats beyond internal management. Pressure from external groups, especially Amorite communities, pushed the court to shift its focus from organization to defense. Defensive lines were constructed not as symbols of strength, but as signs of contraction. Power no longer spread outward, it pulled inward to protect itself. At this stage, the Ur-3 state no longer operated with the confidence of Shulgi's time. Every measure taken to reinforce order brought new costs, tightening the system further. Power became reactive rather than proactive. What had once been an advantage now revealed its reverse, a structure that is too refined struggles to survive in a rapidly changing environment. Ibbi-Sin, the last king of Ur, came to the throne in a world that had changed in substance. Trade routes were disrupted, peripheral regions loosened their ties, and climatic stresses, especially prolonged drought, intensified every existing weakness. Surviving correspondence shows a central court increasingly disconnected from realities beyond the capital. Orders were still issued, but their execution grew ever more uncertain. The fall of Ur did not unfold as a single dramatic moment. there was no decisive battle that sealed its fate. Instead came a slow unraveling. Supplies failed to arrive, armies were not provisioned in time, and central authority gradually lost practical meaning. When finally fell, the cause was not a superior enemy, but a system no longer flexible enough to endure an unstable world. After Ibisin, Sumer ceased to function as an independent political entity. But it did not disappear. What remained were not thrones or armies, but writing, laws, rituals, and memory. Sumer withdrew from power in order to survive as a foundational civilization, studied, copied, applied, and preserved by those who came after. Time did not reverse. Ur was not rebuilt as the center of the world. Yet in this quiet ending, Sumer left behind its most enduring mark. That order, no matter how great, does not last forever, while memory, when recorded, organized and passed on, can outlive any dynasty. And at this final point, the Sumerian king list closes not with victory or catastrophe, but with silence. A deep silence, where power fades away and history begins to exist in another form, still waiting to be listened to.